My name is Andrea, and I run this advocacy campaign ProCash together with colleagues from the industry. It's called Cash Matters and funded, as Bernd has already mentioned, by the ICA. It's an honor and a pleasure to be talking to you about cash, although it's a little like preaching to the choir, I guess, since all of you have an affinity for cash, or as Bernd has said, a passion for cash, otherwise you wouldn't be here. But there may be some thoughts that haven't been so much on the surface when talking about cash that I would like to discuss with you. The first one is when we started Cash Matters about 2 years ago to give cash a voice, because the attacks on cash had grown much more frequent and much stronger. We came from the usual line of arguments. We started with what you just saw, freedom of choice. We started with social inclusion. We started with security, privacy, protection of data. Also, resilience. Central banks are doing an admirable job providing disaster recovery in times of crisis. But the longer we did this, the more we came to the conclusion there's actually more to cash than just these arguments. And that's what I would like to talk to you about today. We commissioned a paper when we came to the conclusion that there's more to cash, that cash plays a really big role in societies and has been playing that role for a long time. And this paper is called Virtually Irreplaceable: Cash as a Distributed Public Infrastructure. We commissioned an anthropologist to write it to get a different perspective and a more comprehensive one on cash, and also, as I said, its role in societies. We have lots of copies over there, and I will be there all day today and tomorrow, and I'd be very happy if you were to come and pick up a copy, or maybe 2 or 3, for your colleagues back home. So what is this paper all about, and what are the arguments for cash that I'm talking about? For me, cash, as I say, is much more than just the usual line of arguments. It's actually one of the building blocks of personal freedom. Cash is protection against many intrusions on so many levels, and it was the Canadian economist Pierre Lemieux who actually said, "It's an intriguing fact that the availability of government currency provides protection against government intrusion itself." So, state-issued physical cash allows users and citizens to create a space outside the state. And once in circulation, it's the only form of payment independent of its issuer, which gives you complete freedom. No other form of payment can do that. And for me, cash is a gift from central banks and governments to their citizens. And I think this freedom associated with cash is also the reason why so many states and countries right now are looking at cash anew and are trying to evaluate its importance for their country. Take a look at Uruguay, for example. They introduced 5 years ago mandatory financial inclusion by law. And now they have, I think, at least 3 or 2 campaigns going asking for this law to be repealed. Because for people, they say many of these people are banked, and many of these people have a bank account. But they say that mandatory financial inclusion leads to economic enslavement, it violates the public's right to privacy, and they say it only serves commercial banks. Many of the people in Uruguay simply don't see a reason why they can no longer manage their daily lives with cash alone, and why they now have to pay fees to do that. Or look at the United States, where several states have been passing or are in the process of passing a bill that makes it mandatory for retailers to accept cash. For the same reason, or look at the Access to Cash report in the UK, which mainly deals with social inclusion, but also comes to the same conclusion that you need cash in order to make society function. Another reason why we are at Cash Matters, and I personally am so passionate about cash, is that cash is some form of power sharing between central banks, governments, and citizens. Cash acts as a claim, ultimately, upon central banks and states to ensure good governance of payment systems and financial systems. because trust in currency is only upheld if all these players act in the population's interest and safeguard a stable and solid financial system. And this, of course, has been the role of central banks for many decades now. Another reason for cash is that it helps in nation building. I think most of you are very invested also in the design of your banknotes, and people are proud of their money. They are proud of their banknotes. I remember when the Armenian Noah's Ark commemorative note came out. Anybody from the Armenian Central Bank here? Okay. I sent it to a friend in the United States, an Armenian who hadn't been home for a long time, just as a little gift. And he called me up and he was close to tears because it touched him so deeply emotionally having this note. And he said it's the whole history of his country basically on one commemorative note. So cash has this emotional appeal as well. And I think emotions are necessary for nation building. And the designs usually reflect a nation's proudest and finest moments. For example, the euro acts as a superglue for the political union. If you look at the euro, the front side of the notes is doors and windows, symbolizing openness and collaboration between the European states and its people. And the back side is bridges, all fictitious buildings, by the way. And these bridges symbolize communication between Europeans and between Europe and the rest of the world. And I sometimes think that maybe the Brexit wouldn't have happened if the UK had been part of the monetary European Union as well, and not only of the political union. Looking at all of this, I think we need to consider cash as a public good, or as we say in the paper, a distributed public infrastructure. And even if you look at it from an economist point of view, it applies because cash is non-excludable, meaning its function as a means of payment, as transfer of value works without compensation, and it's non-rivalrous because its use by one person does not preclude its use by another. So cash is a public good, which makes it public money, as opposed to private money, meaning that cash is the only form of money not controlled by a private entity, and it's the only form of money that is completely free of charge. You don't pay fees when you use cash, and you don't pay with your data. It's just yours to use. And that, of course, is the main reason why cash has been so heavily under attack in the past couple of years. MasterCard started this war on cash 2005, and ever since, many, many other players have joined in. And I think one of the reasons they're so intent on getting cash out of the way is that cash also acts as a brake on fees or a brake on any kind of intrusion, which brings me back to my first argument. Cash is protection on so many levels. Remember the rampage Kenneth Rogoff went on in 2014, 15, when he started to associate cash with crime and terrorism. Of course, it's been disproven by now. At the time, nobody had any arguments against it. Now they're all on the table, and it's very clear that cash is not the weapon of choice for criminals. But his real reason was, of course, the removal of the zero lower bound, being able to impose negative interest rates on savings. And you can't do that if you have cash. As long as you have cash, people can just take out their money. And he wanted to use it as a macroeconomic tool, but this doesn't work as long as cash is around. So another form of protection. And this brings me back full circle to the thesis I made in the beginning, that cash is a form of personal empowerment and individual self-determination, which is the reason we founded Cash Matters, among other things, to give cash a voice, because we are really tiny. I mean, there are huge marketing budgets right now around speaking against cash, and we don't have anything against other forms of payments. We all pay by credit card. mobile, peer-to-peer transactions, NFC technology, contactless, crypto. We all do that, and it's all fine. But what we're here for as Cash Matters is to ensure that cash remains and is an integral part of the payment landscape now and in future. Payments are not an all-or-nothing affair. They're a variegated landscape with different social practices where people use different forms of payment for different purchases and different things they do. And in this landscape, cash has an essential and enduring role to play. So, my final appeal to you as Cash Matters is, first, since cash is a public good, and since you have been the guardians of the economic and currency systems in your country for such a long time, and people trust central banks, I think central banks are among the most trusted and respected institutions in the whole world. I think it's important that central banks retain control of their currency cycle, and I don't want to bore you with the example of Sweden, but it's kind of a good case to see what happens if you actually do delegate the control over your currency cycle to private players. Sweden is almost to go cashless. We talked to a lot of the Swedish people. They are now in the process of passing legislation which makes it mandatory for commercial banks to accept and handle cash again, which hadn't happened for a while. And I'm not sure this will suffice to reverse the trend, because Sweden's cash usage is at about 16 to 18% now. The funny thing about this is, last year there was a survey in Sweden among the Swedish population where 68% of the Swedish said they did not want to go cashless. And they repeated this survey this year, and it was up 4% at 72%. So whatever happens in Sweden does not really reflect the population's wish. And I hope they'll be able to kind of reverse this. And one thing is very, very important that we also learned from Sweden and also now from the UK, which I think is the next country almost cashless by now. They stopped that with the Access to Cash report. And there's the AAA, as we call it, which means access, availability, and acceptance of cash. That is mandatory. And in New York, I think that's the funniest example of a state intervention right now. The Amazon Go store, for example, I'm sure you've read about it, is obliged to accept cash. And it works. It's rather cumbersome, according to all I read, but you can pay cash in the Amazon Go store in New York. And my second point I would like to make is, I know that central banks are neutral, and that central banks have to make sure that payments work, all forms of payment works, and everybody has the same access to markets. But that also applies to cash. And I think it would be good if central banks threw their weight behind cash whenever it doesn't compromise their neutrality. That would be really helpful at the moment, because in many countries it's all about digital, and digital is important. As I said, we're not against other forms of payment, but cash, for all the reasons I just mentioned, is important as well. So if any of the arguments I made, cash being a means of personal empowerment and personal freedom, cash being a public infrastructure, public good, cash being a form of power sharing between citizens, governments, central banks, cash helping in nation building, and cash enabling self-determination, then I'd be delighted if you could speak up for cash as well whenever you have the chance to do so. I think cash deserves it. Thank you very much.